Chapter 16. Harrison's expression changed, and he immediately fished his phone to call Hannah. However, no one answered. Lauren glanced at the time. It's about 15 minutes past 5. Hannah should be picking up her nephew at this time. She usually brings her phone along. Harrison replied with a deep voice, after saying that he called another nanny. Maria, where's Hannah? Oh, she. On the other end of the line, she sounded like she was choking on her sobs. What is it? Harrison asked anxiously. Just now. The school called. Hannah. She got into a car accident. Is it serious? Harrison's face was increasingly gloomy. Hannah and her nephew died on the spot. On the other end of the phone, Maria burst into tears. Harrison put down the phone slowly. He turned on the speakerphone so everyone could hear. With a pale face, Lauren said, Nash, you and Hira take care of Mr. Lewis. We'll go back to have a look. Hannah had been a nanny for the Lewis family for over 20 years after all. In those 20-plus years, she had worked hard and devoted herself to her duties. Now that something had happened, of course they could not sit idly by. Nash asked Dr. Dean to help the old man through the discharge procedures before taking him back home with Hira. Just as Nash and Hira departed, 3 luxurious Rolls-Royces rolled by and parked in front of the hospital. The doors opened and a group of bodyguards dressed in suits and leather shoes exited the vehicles. They were then followed by a lively-looking old man with gray hair. Mr. Dean was shocked to see the old man but greeted him respectfully. Mr. Watson, what brings you here? Brian also quickly stepped forward. He put a hand over his heart and said, Mr. Watson. This person was Walter Watson, the richest man in Johnford, who owned 8 listed companies and whose assets exceed $14 billion. Walter smiled and responded, I heard you were back. Of course I came to visit. Brian laughed and said, I'm flattered that you remember me, Mr. Watson. Walter's chain of business involved an extensive range of fields. He has investment in the vast pharmaceuticals of differing origins in Johnford. Walter sighed. To be honest, I came looking for you too because of my wife's illness. As soon as he said that, Brian and Mr. Dean's expressions darkened. Mrs. Watson suffered from a strange disease. She showed a healthy body index but was unconscious despite there not being any sign of brain death. Brian had already come looking for the Watsons as early as 3 years ago. They tried their best but still failed to find out the cause of Mrs. Watson's ailment. Mr. Watson understood everything from both their expression and was not angry. He just smiled and said, I hear that your teacher is the Imperial Doctor of Capitan, Miracle Dr. Tanner. I wonder if I can ask the revered teacher for help. His teacher was already 90 years old and reached retirement age. Yet, he had been taking care of a certain political figure. His teacher would definitely not help unless it was the few political figures in Capitan who reached out. Forget it. Perhaps it's God's will, Walter said bitterly. Mr. Dean turned to Brian and whispered, Why don't you ask Nash to help? Brian was slightly taken aback, but after thinking about it for a moment, he said, Mr. Watson, my grandmaster has come down the mountain. Maybe he can cure Mrs. Watson's illness. Your grandmaster? Walter was a little dazed. Dr. Tanner's master was already over 90 years old. If he was Brian's grandmaster, would that not make him over 100 years old? He thought of Thomas King, Dr. Tanner's master's master, who could also be found in the annals of medical history. The man's ability must be beyond doubt for him to be part of the same cohort. Then, might I trouble you to request him for help, Dr. Tanner? If my wife can be cured, I'm willing to pay $11 million in consultation fee. Chapter 17. Walter said with a hand over his heart. Mr. Dean took a deep breath. $11 million. That was equivalent to Johnford Hospital's profits for 1 quarter. Dr. Tanner's consultation fee was only slightly over $28,000. If he earned $11 million, that was equivalent to about 390 transactions. Brian responded with his hand over his heart as well and said, I'll inform him about this, but don't hold out too much hope. His grandmaster was a man of cold temperament. He seemed somewhat unreasonable, so he was not sure if he could convince him. Walter thought of the man who was over 100 years old and could only nod with a wry smile. I'm sorry to trouble you, Dr. Tanner. At the Lewis estate, a group of family members was in the yard. 2 corpses, one large and one small, were placed on the ground onto stretchers. The older one was in their 50s and the younger one was only 7 or 8 years old. After Nash checked the corpses, he sighed helplessly in his heart. The adult's chest was sunken, and their heart was crushed. Half of the child's head was missing. Even if a master was here, they would not be able to help. Uncle must have given the order. He was worried that Aunt Hannah would reveal what happened, so he killed her to silence her, said Hira, her expression cold. She looked at Nash after she said that as if to verify whether her guess was correct. Nash said nothing, so Hira had no choice but to walk to her mother's side. Hira, you have to watch your words. Hubert is Herman's own son. How could he hurt his own father? Said an old man with white hair. This was Herman's cousin, Charles Lewis. Now that Hubert had a relationship with the Watsons, he, of course, wanted to be on Hubert's side. Hira sneered. I bumped into a group of hitmen when I was making my way home yesterday. If it weren't for Nash, you wouldn't even see me now. She had not wanted to talk about this, but since she was being questioned, she had to expose her uncle. Hearing this, Lauren's and Harrison's eyes went wide. Harrison panicked. Hira, why didn't you tell us earlier? It was no wonder that Hira took so long to arrive yesterday. It turned out she had encountered hitmen on the way. Who sent them, though? Hira thought about what happened yesterday and felt a little scared. I didn't want you to worry. Is this related to your grandfather's poisoning? Kane asked calmly. It was obvious he did not take Hira's safety seriously. Of course, it's related. I noticed Uncle looking surprised when I came back to the house yesterday. He was surprised that I came back alive, so he must have hired them, Hira said as she looked at Kane expressionlessly. Kane stroked his snow-white goatee and questioned with a smile, Do you have evidence? Hira said, Both Scotty and Nash can testify. Kane laughed. Scotty is your best friend. And Nash is your fiancé. You guys fabricated a lie to slander Hubert. You're just trying to get all of the family assets, no? That's not true, Hira said anxiously. There really were hitmen yesterday. She looked at Nash again as she spoke. However, Nash still ignored her. Hira said angrily, Nash, say something. What can I say? Didn't we run into hitmen yesterday? Didn't you beat them all up? I think so. Nash nodded in response. His answer left Hira dumbfounded. What did he mean, I think so? Kane laughed and added, Is it because you haven't discussed it with one another yet? Do you want to go back and discuss how to frame Hubert? Chapter 18. Hira was so anxious she almost cried. Nash was really unreliable. If she had known earlier, she would not have stood up and made a fool of herself. Nash turned to look at the several law enforcement officers at the side. Are there any results from this case? A middle-aged law enforcement officer in his 40s said, It's a traffic accident. The driver was drunk and didn't manage to stop the car in time. Immediately after that, the female law enforcement officer beside him gave more detailed information. The driver is 42 years old and has 20 years of driving experience. He was driving a small truck from a renovation company at that time, and it was filled with construction materials. Has the driver gone through a physical examination? Nash asked. The middle-aged law enforcement officer replied, His alcohol test indicates that he was drunk driving. Only those who don't cooperate with us for the alcohol test get sent to the hospital for blood tests. Kane sneered. You don't even understand this bit of common sense. You truly are a bumpkin from the mountains. Nash glanced at Kane lightly. Old man. Was I talking to you? Kane was startled, but then he cursed angrily. Bastard. Who do you think you're talking to? He was Herman's cousin. Even Hubert and Harrison dared not act so presumptuously in front of him, so how dare a bumpkin talk to him like that? Nash did bother paying attention to him. He looked at the two law enforcement officers and said, I once encountered a murder case where the driver used alcohol to kill. Nash's words sent a slight shiver through the two law enforcement officers. They looked at each other. Then, the middle-aged law enforcement officer said, We'll take the perpetrator to the hospital immediately for a comprehensive examination. Without wasting any more time, the two left the manor before the sky turned dark. Harrison got someone to send the bodies of Hannah and her nephew to the funeral parlor for cremation. Lauren paid reliefs worth $400,000 to Hannah's and the child's families through the company account. That night, Lauren received a call while she was eating. She did not say anything about the call, but her face turned pale. Hira asked cautiously, "Is it about the matter with Drake Group?" Lauren drank half a glass of her red wine without even looking at Hira. Harrison bowed his head and remained silent. The atmosphere was extremely depressing. Hira's throat was a little stuffed up. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't handle things well." Lauren poured herself a little more red wine and continued to drink. "Helena came to see me today. She asked me to kneel down to her. Otherwise, the Watsons will end the partnership between Baroque and Drake Group," Hira explained aggrievedly. Harrison slammed a palm on the table. "They've gone too far with their bullying." Hira shook Lauren's arm and whined in a teary voice, "Mom, please don't blame me." Nash felt his heart melt at her soft and distressed voice. This woman was being so coquettish. It was a pity she was not being coquettish to him. Lauren sighed slightly. "You did the right thing. I don't blame you." Her daughter was her treasure, so of course, she would not blame her. It was just a pity. Drake Group was one of the top 10 enterprises in Johnford. A business partnership with Drake Group would bring Baroque back to life. This was their last resort. She just did not expect their last support to be shattered. Nash took a sip of the red wine and said with a smile, "Uncle, Aunt, I'm full. I'm going out for a walk, so take your time." When he went outside the villa, Nash took out his phone and called Theo. "Nash, I swear, this was an accident. My father-in-law is suffering from syphilis, and we went abroad for treatment. I already asked my wife to deal with it. She'll be heading to the Lewises tomorrow." Theo did not even bother beating around the bush and immediately explained the situation promptly. Nash hung up the phone immediately. Just when he was about to return to the villa, there was a sudden gust of wind. Nash stopped. He turned around and looked behind him. At some point, a burly man was already standing under a tree across the private road. He was above stage 9, a master of martial arts. Nash narrowed his eyes and asked, "Who are you?" Chapter 19. The brawny man said nothing. He just turned around and left. After a moment's hesitation, Nash stepped forward and followed him. A Cullinan was parked on the side of the main road outside the manor. It was the same one he saw when he went shopping with Hira before. The brawny man walked up to the car and opened the door. Nash understood what he meant and got into the car without hesitation. An old man and a middle-aged man were in it. The old man's aura was restrained but also at ease. There was a sense of majesty and kindness in his eyes. The middle-aged man had a beard and exuded a murderous aura. It was an aura that was tempered from being on the battlefield for a long time. The old man put a hand to his heart and said with a smile, "I'm Zachariah Sinclair. Hello, young Nash Calcraft." The middle-aged man kept things curt and simply said, "Stellar Orwell. Did you look for me for something?" Nash said in an extremely indifferent tone as he looked out the car window. He thought these people had been targeting Hira before. Unexpectedly, they were after him. He hated the feeling of being followed. However, he sensed no malice from these people. Otherwise, he would not have wasted his time and taken a seat. Seeing Nash's indifference, Zachariah laughed and said, "Don't blame Stellar. We just wish to get your help in curing an ailment." "Is this how you invite someone?" Nash asked coldly. Zachariah felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave hearing how cold his tone was. His expression changed slightly, and he immediately circulated his inner energy to resist the pressure Nash brought about. However, in less than 3 seconds, all his inner energy dissipated. Zachariah's face was pale as he stared at Nash in disbelief. His strength as a martial arts master was crushed by this young man so easily. When he heard Scotty mention this person's strength yesterday, he thought she had been exaggerating. Looking at it now, he was much stronger than what Scotty had described. Zachariah put his hand to his heart again. "Mr. Calcraft, he's a unique individual. You're the only one who can cure him." Nash reeled his aura back in and looked up at the rearview mirror only to catch Stellar watching him. Stellar looked away and rumbled in a deep voice, "The person you'll be healing is the warden of the Northern Territory." Nash's eyes narrowed slightly when he heard that. A warden, and one who was in charge of a territory. His powers should be monstrous. There were only 4 wardens in Draconia. After a moment of silence, Nash asked slowly, "What's wrong with him?" "A poison that causes deossification. A parasitic poison," Astonishment colored Nash's eyes. He had traveled all over the country and practiced countless medicines, but he had never treated parasitic poison. A poison that could cause deossification was one extremely potent parasitic poison. Once poisoned, the victim's bones and joints would loosen within 1 month and start decaying by the second. In 3 months, the bones would be reduced to ashes. It was a kind of parasitic poison that made living worse than death. The warden who commanded thousands of troops would be brutally murdered just like that. It was most likely done by his trusted aide. It's been 25 days. Stellar looked worried. He turned back to look at Nash and asked, "Can he be cured?" "I'm not sure, but I can try." "I won't put the warden at risk if you're not fully confident." Stellar added coldly, "The Northern Territory is under the warden's protection. If something happens to him during the treatment, the border will be thrown into chaos." Nash shrugged his shoulders, "Then hire someone else." Chapter 20. Among all the miscellaneous complex diseases, cancer and poison were the most difficult to deal with. Nash was confident when it came to treating cancer, but he might not be able to treat a parasitic poison. Hospital equipment could still detect cancer, but poison is undetectable at all. Its treatment is even more difficult. Nash opened the door and prepared to get out of the car. "How confident are you?" Stellar asked again. 20%. Nash left without looking back after replying. Stellar went completely silent. After a long while, he took a deep breath and asked Mr. Sinclair, "What do you think?" Zachariah replied, "We don't have much time left. It'll be difficult to find someone else apart from him." He paused for a bit before turning to look Nash's back as the men disappeared into the distance. Then he continued, "The fact that he is able to cure old Louis' stomach cancer is enough to show that his medical skills are terrifying.